Okay, in this video we are going to look at subdivision surfaces, talk a little bit about how they work, and we'll also talk about editing the polygonal mesh and getting into some of the polygon extrudes, inner extrudes, and a little bit about the knife tool and loop selections. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Cinema here. And first off, let's just talk about subdivision surfaces. So you might have heard of something called box modeling, and that is basically using a subdivision surface object, or in some programs, a smoothing operator, or even a subdivision cage, some programs might call it, but it basically smooths out the edges of a polygonal object to give you a smooth surface. So the way it does that, it uses a type of calculation that utilizes NURBS, N-U-R-B-S, which stands for non-uniform rational B-splines. So we've got that in our splines that we use. We have B-spline. So I'll show you a quick example here, just to get you into the sort of idea of how these guys work. So I'm going to come up here into my front view, and I'm just going to draw a linear spline. So I went to my pen tool, and I'm going to come over here and hit linear. And I'm just going to use my grid as a guide and quickly draw a little spline here. Okay, so I'm going to hit escape, and now we've got that spline. Now, one thing I found in the newer version of Cinema 4D is that it is a little hard to see these points with this darker gray. So I want to show you real quick, if you want to change those, here's how you can do that. I'm going to come into my Edit Preferences. And then when that opens, we're going to come down to Scheme Colors. And then we want to go to Editor Colors. And then you'll see active points and inactive points. Now, if I come over to my selection tool and I select, I'll just click and drag a couple. Now that orange is easy to see, so we'll leave that active points fine, but inactive points is this dark bluish gray. So what I'm going to do is just move that to maybe something more like a brighter yellowish color maybe. So we can see how those look. Okay, so now I can see those a lot better, and we'll know they're selected when they're orange. You don't have to do this. I just, sometimes with a darker background, it's harder for me to see those. And I know when you're watching a video, sometimes it's compressed and it's hard to see them as well. So I'll do it for this, for training. If you want to do it for your own, you can make them red, you can make them whatever color you want, but just so you know, that's why my colors might be a little bit different when you see that. So that's fine, and I am going to go ahead and close that out. All right, so now if I come in here, I've got my spline, and this is our linear spline. And I'm going to go ahead and go to my object tool and just drag this guy down, holding Control or Command, right? So I can make a copy. And then we'll take this one, and what I want to do here is change that spline type, if I click on that new spline, to Bezier. So this is just like Illustrator, right? So if I come into my selection tool and I select one of these guys, we now have our Bezier handles. If you go to your Move tool, then you can adjust those handles. And if you want to break the handles before you grab one, just hold down Shift, and you can break that. Now, if you want to get rid of, if you want to have a linear interpolation here instead of your Bezier interpolation, you can always just select one of these, right-click on it, right-click, and go to Hard Interpolation. That will give you an angle point. If you've got a linear point and you want to turn it into a Bezier, go to Soft Interpolation. And then you also have things such as equal tangent length, equal tangent direction, etc. So if you get them out of whack and you want to bring them back in together, so if I Shift selected this guy and broke it, I could always come here and just say equal tangent length and equal tangent direction, and at least they'll be back locked up in the same length, okay? So that's how you can do that. So that's a Bezier spline, just like Illustrator. Now if we take this and go to my object tool one more time, Command drag down. Now what we can also use is what's called a B-Spline. If I click on that, come over to my spline type, and I hit B-Spline, now you'll see what's happening. If I go to my points mode, you can see, on these guys here, as we move through, right, our points on the linear are just straight lines in between, boom, boom, boom. Our points on the Bezier, even though we have our handles, it still goes through each point, right? But then on that B-Spline, our last one here, these are just sort of more act as an influence. And it is using math to create a smooth curve through all of our points. So if we come down here, we can start creating some really smooth curves, right? These are great for camera paths because it's hard to get a kink in them, like a really rough sort of corner point almost. And speaking of corner points, if you want a corner, you almost have to really put two of these on top of each other to start to get that idea of a straight corner. So that is where that sort of will come in handy here in a minute when we talk about subdivision surfaces. So if I zoom out a little here, and we'll talk about now another thing with these B-splines. So if I take a rectangle spline, and I'm going to scale it down by hitting T, scale it down. We'll just drag it over here. So this rectangle spline, I'm going to make it editable so we can see its points. And if we look at that, that is right now a linear spline. If I make a copy, so again, I could just command drag it over. What I could do now is if I take that spline, instead of linear, make it a B-spline, you can see, if I go to my points mode here, the points are still in the same place, but that's pulling on those curves and creating that curve in between. Now, this is the same thing that'll happen with a subdivision surface object once we have a cube. So a cube would end up becoming more of this sort of blobby sphere. It's not quite a perfect circle. But if we did need a perfect circle, once we get a few more edges, a few more points pulling on it in an even manner, so we come in here to an inside, and I'll scale that down again, hit T, E to move, drag it over, and I'll make that, right now we're a 6 side, that would work, but we'll go to an 8 side even. And if I came and took that, made that editable, so we can see our points, and then created a copy of that by Ctrl or Command dragging over. Now we can see what happens if we take that and turn that into a B-spline. We've got a very, grab all of these guys so we can see all our points. So now you can see with those points serving as an even influence around, it becomes a perfect circle, right? So, and that can be as low as 6 points. 4 is just not quite enough, just on the way it works. But if you need to do a cylinder, or you want to start getting like perfect holes in a polygon mesh, this is the way that you can get to that. And we'll be doing that in a few tutorials from now. We've got all of this. Hopefully that helps you understand the idea of B-splines, which is what NURBS is based on, and versus our Beziers and our linears, and how those points are just kind of an influence, right, on these. And you can start to create some really organic shapes really easy. But it's a little hard to control if you want a sharp corner, right? You need all these guys kind of coming into the same area. All right. So now let me do a new file new, and you can follow along on this one. I think this one is a good one to follow along on. And we'll talk about using this with Polygon objects. So what I'm going to do first is just create a new a new cube. And in this cube, I am now going to create a subdivision surface object. So that's this first one here, and drag my cube into it. Now a shortcut, if I undo, any of these things like extrudes or lathes or whatever, if you hold down your Alt or Option key when you click it, it will automatically make your selected object a child of it. So it's just a quick shortcut when you're creating these type of things to speed up your workflow. Now, first off, I want to make sure that yours looks the same as mine. So you can see now that we've added that to the subdivision surface, it has become this sort of sphere-like object, right? It is smoothing those corners out. First off, I'm going to hit Display Garage Shading Lines so we can see our polygons, how it's affecting them. And if I click on my checkbox up here on Subdivision Surface, you can see it goes from that six-sided cube down to this subdivided surface. Now, it still is just this cube. So if we start editing that cube, it will change here. So if we come into our cube and we drag it taller or we make it shorter, right, it's going to just smooth out exactly where we are. So if we want the way that these work, as we looked before, is as points get closer to each other, they have more influence and they become almost more of a corner or a sharp edge. So if we came into our cube as it stands and we come down to our object properties, and on our Y, let's just start adding some subdivisions. So I'm going to add 1, 2, 3, okay? And if I want to see that, make sure we are in Display Isoparms. All right, and that'll show you those in this case. All right, so we're doing that. Now, the other thing is your view may look different than mine. I usually in Options turn off isoline editing. So if yours looks a lot different, you might want to turn that off. But you can see here, as we add more segments, it gets a little tighter at the top, and if we start adding some at the side, it becomes more like a cube, and it's just rounding in between those subdivisions that we have happening there. So if we look at our cube, if we turn off our subdivision surface, we can see, oops, there's our subdivisions, turn it on, and now we get that subdivided mesh. All right, now I'm going to go back to my cube and make that a 1, 1, 1 on subdivisions. All right, and now what I want to do is make the cube editable, not the subdivision surface, but the cube. So just hit C, and if I turn off my subdivision surface for a second, now we can see we've got a cube that is no longer parametric. It's a polygon object, and I could come in here and grab a, face or a polygon, undo that. I could come over here to edge selection, grab an edge and move that edge. I could also go into point selection and grab a point and move that point. Okay, so once it's polygonal, you can use all of these tools to alter your object. Now, another tool you use is called the knife tool. So what I'm going to do is select my cube, make sure I'm in polygon mode, and I'm going to do a Command-All or Control-A, Command-A or Control-A for select all. And now I'm going to use my knife tool. So to use the knife tool, I'm going to hit K, and you can see this little pop-up happens. And before I do anything, move my mouse or hit anything else, I'm going to go ahead and hit L for loop or path cut. So now if I come in here and start rolling along an edge of my polygon, you can see it's telling me where I might cut. So I can cut this way, wherever. So if I came just sort of right in the middle here, and I click once, what it does, it makes a cut, and then up here it tells me where in my sort of that plane it cut. So it cut at 52.64%, or over here we could see it cut at a distance of 105. I know my cube is 200 by 200 by 200, so I could just come over here and change that to 100, hit enter. Oh, sorry, on the distance, yeah, 100, hit enter. There we go. It's right in the center, not the offset, or offset 50%. You can click up here as well. So if I wanted it at 25%, I could hit there. And until you create another cut or go to another tool, this cut is movable and it's malleable. Another thing you can do up here is if we come in, let me double click this and make it 50% again. That's right in the middle. I can also start adding some cuts. So I can add another one, and now that sort of makes it into thirds. This one, now we're in quarters, right? So if you want to have even subdivisions, you can use these tools over here, these little plus and minuses. Okay, so now if we want to turn on our subdivision surface now, we can see that gives us that more solid shape, right? It's not as smoothed and bulbous. All right. Now, if we want to do the same thing on another plane, we could come in here, cut again. Again, I could say 50%, and then do a 1, 2, 1, 2, and then maybe I come over here, click 50%, and then maybe 1, 2. All right, so now if we turn that subdivision surface on, it looks just like a smoothed cube. Okay, so it's a little nicer. This is where you might want to set that up in advance, right? So you might want to come in here and set that up with your subdivisions before you make it editable, or you can always come in and use your knife tool. The closer these edges get to each other, the more it will become like a corner. So this is where our loop selection comes in. So loop selection, we're going to use the edge mode now. So edges mean I can just grab an edge, right? I can shift select. So if I wanted to grab this whole loop, I'd get rid of that. Maybe I come in here, grab another one, grab another one. That's kind of crazy. So you can always do U and then hit L for loop selection, or you can come up here to select, and the very first one down here, loop selection. Now, as you roll over, you can see that lets you select a loop of edges around your object. So if I go here and I grab that loop selection and I go to my move tool or just hit E for move, I can now kind of just move that up closer. And now you can see the closer I get, the tighter that gets as a bevel around the edge. Now, if I would want that on the other sides, I would have to come into my cube. Maybe I'd go loop selection again, UL, and grab this one and shift select that one. Now, instead of moving them, since they are from the center point, I could always use a scale. So I could just hit my scale tool here or hit T. And then if I just scale those on the Z, while they're both selected, then they'll move simultaneously. So that gets a little tighter, and I can do the same thing, UL, and then I just grab this one, shift select this other one, T, this time on the X, get it over close to the edge, and now you can see we get a really nice bevel on there. And then, if we turn that off, this is what our mesh looks like, right? So it's still just a cube. It has a few polygons in it, but that subdivision surface is creating those bevels and those little roundings in between those edges. All right, so that's the basic thing here of how these subdivision surfaces work. Now, another thing we'll be doing and using in this is extrudes and inner extrudes to create some more polygonal geometry out of our objects, to add some geometry. So in that case, if we're in our cube here, we could come in and maybe I'm going to grab the cube and maybe go to my polygon mode, and I'm going to select all 4 of these. And then I can go ahead and right click and go to extrude and click and drag to the right, and it will go out. If I undo that, if I click and drag to the left, it will go in. And what it's doing is it's creating new geometry around the outside and then moving back or forward in space with those polygons we've selected. All right, so that is extrusion. I'll undo one more time. Now you can also just use, if you're in your move tool, you can hold down Control or Command and then click and drag and do the same thing by just holding that. So if I came over here and I did a little Control, click and drag, and then again, right? So you could see where you could start quickly creating some shapes. Now, as we turn on our subdivision, now that becomes smoothed. So this is where you would add some more cuts. So if I went my KL and started coming in here, select all just to make sure I cut all my polygons. So now you could see with a few cuts, we could start getting something looking pretty nice. Oops, let's get over this edge. Okay, and we'll render that. So you could see how by, again, not a lot of geometry, we can start creating some interesting things. And again, if you grab these edges, start moving things out, you start creating curves and bulges and smoothing things. All right, so that's our extrude. Now what we also have is what's called an extrude inner. So let me go ahead and just hide these two. And I will create a new cube. And we'll make this 3 by 3 by 3. And all right, that looks good. And I'm going to make that editable by hitting C. Now I'll create a subdivision surface. I'm just going to hold down my Option or Alt key and click on that. Boom, and it makes it a child, and we're ready to go. Now this is also where that your options here of the isoline editing, if you want to grab and see your polygons sort of curved on the object, you can use that isoline editing. I like to see my actual mesh of my polygon object, so I turn that off. So that's what I'll be doing here, is using that tool that way. You can choose how to use it how you want, but if you get confused by what I'm selecting, that's why I just have that isoline editing turned off on mine. Okay, so now let's talk about a little bit about. Let me turn off my subdivision for a second. So we did our extrudes, and now extrude could be not just one polygon like I did before, but we could do a whole loop. I did a UL for loop select. Then I could do a D for extrude and extrude out, right? And then a lot of times if you've got your subdivision on, you might just want to extrude one more time to get a little bit of that edge, okay? So that's something that can happen there. I'll just undo a few times to get back in. So if I did that loop selection, held down Shift, UL for loop, I could grab both, right? And then maybe D and then extrude inner. Not extrude inner, D, then just extrude to the left, right? And so now I've got this interesting shape that way. And if we came in, we could start smoothing that. Now another object or type of tool we have is an extrude inner. So what extrude inner does is, if I select a polygon and I do a I or right click extrude inner and click and drag to the left, you can see it extrudes on the same plane, but goes just inside, scales down evenly, and then creates new polygons around it. So I could do an extrude inner, and if I wanted, I could just move it. So if I do my move tool and then create like a little bevel, right? Something like that. I could maybe at that point do a D extrude and extrude a little hole back inside or come out further. So maybe I just need that for the subdivision to give me a little more detail around there. You can also use it on multiple objects. So if I undo, so it's all of that. If I did an extrude inner, say for this spoon 2, 3, 4, I could do an extrude inner. And if I look over at my settings, preserve groups is on by default. So if I click and drag, we can see it held these three together, but this one did not, even though I had preserved groups. Now the reason that is this maximum angle is at 89 degrees. That's a 90-degree angle around the corner. So we just need to say, hey, it's okay to go up to 90 degrees. And now you can see that whole thing is now extruded. So if I would go and hit a D for extrude and come in, now I can get a nice little inset, right? So this is how you can start to create some really nice details. And then again, if we throw on subdivision surface with a very low polygon mesh. Okay, so we've got that. So we've got the extrude polygons, extrude inners. One other thing we'll use is, let's go back to turn off our subdivision. And I'll come in here. We'll use the bridge tool. So I'm going to shift select 2 points that aren't connected. I'm just going to hold down Control or Command and drag up one and drag up again. All right. So I've got this sort of selected here. And what I want to do is I want to select these 2 facing polygons. I just shift selected those 2 by rotating around. If your brush is too big, you can just like Photoshop, use your bracket keys. And if you're in your selection set here, so just your selection's too big, just make it smaller. Shift 1, rotate around, hold down Shift, select the other one. Now what we're going to do now is use a bridge tool, hit B for bridge, or you can right click and hit bridge. And then you just want to go from corner to corner. So use the same corner, and then that will create a bridge in between. All right. So now we've got, turn that on. Oops. So now we've got some objects that. Now that can also be used to create holes. So if I turn that off and I came in, so maybe to here and here, and I've got both of those selected, I shift selected around. I'm going to do an extrude inner. So right there, so an I or extrude inner, right click extrude inner. And I've extruded both of those down. Now what I want to do is use the bridge tool here. Now I can't really see it, so I've got both polygons still selected. So I'm going to go to display, I'm going to go to lines, so I can see all of my outlines through it. So if I go B, I go from this top corner to this top corner, go back to display, road shading lines. Now you can see it created a nice hole in there for us. So it deleted these 2 polygons on the outside and then created our 4 polygons on the inside. Again, turn on our subdivision surface and you can see what's going on there. Now, when you look at the subdivision surface, by default, this editor is at 2 and then the renderer is at 2. So you could crank it up for the renderer. And if I do here, it's still at 2, but if I go to the picture viewer, you can see it's a lot smoother. So it's using the renderer there. Going up to like 3 is pretty nice, is easy. Be careful with this. If you go up too fast, you can see how dense, how quickly that mesh gets very dense. And that can really slow down your computer. So I would just watch that. Usually a 3 is good, but working, if your computer starts slowing down, just bring it back down to like a 2, and then you can always crank it up when it's time to render, or if you need to do tests. All right, so in this I talked about non-uniform rational B-splines, and that's the NURBS sort of math that it's using to create this smoothing effect from a subdivision surface. I also talked about different spline types to demonstrate how that works as far as it influences the edges versus having the edges flow through the points, creating our smooth surfaces and our curved surfaces. And then we went in a little bit and talked about extruding polygons, doing an extrude inner on polygons, using the knife tool in a loop mode to create more geometry, and also using the bridge tool to bridge between 2 polygons and also to create a hole between 2 polygons if you go through the main mass of your object. So I hope that makes sense. And in our next tutorial, we will be using some of these techniques to model a mug. All right, I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.